Well, welcome to the second in a series on God and science. So for those of you that weren't here for the first class last week, we talked about how the view of the universe at different times throughout history has had a lot to do with how people thought about God, all the way from changes to thinking that the Earth was the center of the solar system, to Newtonian physics and a dualistic notion of God, a clockwork universe where everything was determined. And if you knew exactly where every particle was, then you would know what everything was going to do for the rest of existence, which is pretty bleak if you ask me. And then we get into quantum physics, which talks about uncertainty and everything totally interconnected with everything else. And as science has changed throughout the centuries, it's always taken general humanity quite a long time to catch up with the paradigm shift in how people tend to think about the world. So most people are still stuck in Newtonian physics because it's the way the world seems to be according to the world of the senses. Okay, well, I can see myself standing here and I see you over there. You're separate from me. I can look at the clock and time is going in this linear progression from past to present and future, and certainly something in the future couldn't change something in the past. Wrong, according to quantum physics. There's something called retrocausality, where something that happens, at least in the present, can change something that has already happened. So today we're going to explore the Big Bang and creation stories of different traditions and see how this might relate to our notion of God and how science seems to go with different notions of God. So we're going to look at the transcendent notion of God. And the question that's been there throughout humanity when people were capable of thinking of such a question is, well, not only where did I come from, but where did this universe come from? And we have the creation myths of all the different cultures, which tend to have quite a few similarities to them. And then we have the generally accepted story of science, which you can think of as another creation myth, because we don't know that something's going to come along down the road that goes, well, no, we thought it was the Big Bang, but maybe it's something different than that. But scientists pose similar kinds of questions. Well, what was there before the Big Bang? And there's kind of a cop-out answer. Well, that's not a meaningful question because time didn't exist before the Big Bang. Well, that may be true. And space didn't exist before the Big Bang. That may also be true, but somehow we got this infinitely dense singularity of unimaginable heat that in the tiniest infinitesimal fraction of a second exploded and brought forth the whole universe. Well, where did that come from? You know, did it drop out of the sky? Well, if it did, where's the sky that it dropped out? Where did that come from? And then you have turtles all the way down. Okay, so let's look at some of the different stories. Hinduism, the most ancient scriptures are the Upanishads and the Vedas. So I'm going to read you some passages, brief passages. This is from the Rig Veda. And it wasn't written. These were passed down orally until there was even written language. Thousands of years ago. Then was neither non-existence nor existence. Try that one on. Then there was neither non-existence nor existence. There was no realm of air, no sky beyond it. Death was not then, nor there was anything immortal. No sign was there. The days and nights divider, darkness there was. Sounds like Yoda. At first concealed in darkness, this all was indiscriminated chaos. All that existed then was void and formless. By the great power of warmth was born that one. So again, something from nothing. And from the Upanishads, in the beginning, my dear, this was being alone, one only, without a second. Some people say, in the beginning, this was non-being alone, one only, without a second. From that non-being, being was produced. And this is in the form of a dialogue between a couple people in the Upanishads. But how indeed, my dear, could it be thus, said he, the sage Uddalaka. How could being be produced from non-being? Same question the scientists are asking. On the contrary, my dear, in the beginning, this was being alone, one only, without a second. It thought. Now, again, you can break this into pieces. Well, there wasn't non-being or being, but somehow there was an it that could think. Well, how could the it think, and what would it have to think about? Again, reasonable question. It thought, may I be many, may I grow forth. It emitted heat. Well, the Big Bang was unbelievably hot. In fact, there wasn't even any visible light after the Big Bang for 380,000 years, because there was just a sea of subatomic particles, and it took it that long to cool down to where there could be visible light. So it wasn't an instant, well, let there be light. You think of the Big Bang, the explosion, there couldn't be anything brighter. Well, if there was anything to see it, it couldn't see anything for 380,000 years afterwards. Okay. Now, in Judaism, the mystical writings of it are in the Kabbalah, and kind of the heart of the Kabbalah is called the Zohar. So this is from the Zohar. At the outset, the decision of the king made a tracing in the supernal effulgence, a lamp of scintillation, and there issued within the impenetrable recesses of the mysterious limitless, pretty cool, a shapeless nucleus enclosed in a ring, neither white nor black, nor red nor green, nor any color at all. When he took measurements, he fashioned colors to show within, and within the lamp there issued a certain effluence from which colors were imprinted below. The most mysterious power enshrouded in the limitless clave, as it were, without cleaving its void, remained wholly unknowable, until from the force of the strokes there shone forth a supernal and mysterious point. Sound a little like the Big Bang Theory? Beyond that point there is no knowable. That's what the cosmologists are saying too. You can ask the question, but it's not meaningful. And we can't imagine, at least with our ordinary thinking, well, you can imagine there just being empty space, but there wasn't space until there was the Big Bang. In fact, it wasn't space that was created, it was space-time that was created at that. But before that, there wasn't space-time. You could say there was neither space nor time before that. Okay. In the shorter version of the Zohar, it says something like this, that there was a supernal, uncreated, infinite sea of light, nothing distinguishable from anything else. And the divine being decided to hollow out a vacuum in this sea of uncreated light, and through that vacuum emerged a shaft of light, and that light was the stuff of creation. Well, again, that's pretty much what the Big Bang sounds like. So one question to ask yourself, how did these mystics thousands of years ago come up with this? I don't think they had a committee that sat down and go, well, these people are wondering what happened, we better make up some story for them. But as I was talking last time, the earliest form of science was probably the yogis in India exploring the inner realms through meditation. And so through very deep meditation and mystical experiences, the mystics tried to translate what they experienced, and in the poetic form and whatever symbolism they could come up with, that's where these stories come from. It was an attempt to describe something that basically they're saying, well, we can't really describe what came before, but this is what it seemed happened once there was an existence. So what does that mean about, well, a little more here. The Old Testament, of course, we're all familiar with Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So, same kind of story. There wasn't something, and then there became something. And so, I think most of us probably tend to think of, when we think of God and creation, as God was kind of a solo player. You know, this God that usually is described as masculine, we say he, although in the Hebrew, the correct term in Genesis is Elohim, which means we. It's a plural, which means Father, Mother God, but that kind of, here we do have committees and political forces at work going, I invented the internet, and, you know. So it became this masculine, just God decided to have a creation, okay, zap. So, and this is where I think the dualistic idea of God really has been deeply ingrained throughout history, because there was a separated God that decided to make a creation, and here's the creation, and here's God, and they're separated. And then what happens in creation, there's different stories in different religions, and we're going to be getting into that more, particularly next week. What's the relationship of manifestation to the transcendent? But the transcendent is viewed as something separate and really, it may have gotten the ball rolling, but it's not emerged in it. Well, if you're familiar with Proverbs, so I'm going to read you one that you may be familiar with, and then I will comment on this. This is from the book of Proverbs. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. When he established the fountains of the deep. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world. Well, some people interpret wisdom as being the same being as Sophia, which is also present in other traditions. It's like the archetype of wisdom. So here we don't have this just separated God deciding to have a creation. There's this being and this force of wisdom, and something I'll be getting into probably in some later meetings is what I call the eliciting force. I think we tend to look at things anthropomorphically, and we think of God up here going, not much going on here. I think I'll have something to experience or something to know. And it being a unilateral decision, well, I think the way reality with a capital R works is simultaneously on the, whatever you want to call that, God or the transcendence, and of it seeming to be a desire coming from there was a pull of a desire for there to be something to know and be known, and it's only because of this partnership between the two that there could be a manifestation. This was the start of there being something to have a relationship to. So when we talk about God, well, something interesting I came across, and this was some commentary written by a philosopher from India, I think a more contemporary philosopher, saying that words that we ascribe to God and across a lot of traditions, for one, omnipresence, okay? We think God is omnipresent, but if you think about that, omnipresence requires there to be a space to be present too. Whether or not that space is our reality, which, and I'll juggle back and forth between physics and mysticism. The physicists say there could be 10, 11, or even 21 dimensions, and we're only aware of 3 of space and 1 of time, but the other ones are curled up. And there'll probably be some physical evidence of at least some higher dimensions in the next year or 2 from the Large Particle Accelerator in Europe, which will verify something that mystics have known for thousands of years. There's other realms of reality that are not up there somewhere. They're co-present here, but our usual means of perception don't enable us to perceive that. Okay. Let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions about anything so far. So, yes?
Actually, it's a question from last week, if you don't mind.
Okay.
My brain's been stuck on it for a week now. And if it goes back to the
random number generator,
how can you ever tell a number generated by random number generator isn't random?
Okay, the question is how can you, this is from the first class, tell that I'll say the output is not random. Well, you can statistically analyze it, because if, let's say, you had to print out 1 million numbers, then statistically it should be pretty much the same number of zeros, ones, twos, threes, fours, fives, and so on. And you can analyze a smaller sample, let's say of several thousand. That would be enough to tell if it deviated from being random or not. So the experiments they did, they looked to see if the output at a statistically significant level deviated from being random. And there's a very easy mathematical way of doing that. So it's not number by number, it's the whole pattern of numbers they're looking at. Okay, well, back to the Big Bang, because that'll take us a little aside to go any more into that. So omnipresence requires space. Well, there wasn't space before there was an existence. So, and that's why I think the mystics pretty much across tradition say there's nothing you can say about fill-in-the-blank name for that which is beyond existence and non-existence. Our minds can't go there. You can't have a mind and be there by definition. And so it doesn't make sense to think of God as being omnipresent in that transcendent place that's beyond everything. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, well, let's look at the other qualities we generally ascribe to God. Omniscience, knows everything that ever has happened, is happening, and will happen. Well, what's something you need to have if you're going to know everything that ever has, is, or will happen? What's a feature of existence? Time. There's no time before the Big Bang. Time only has existence in the relative relationship between different things that are in movement. Because the theory of relativity about this. So, in fact, I may have mentioned this last week, but in a Scientific American from a few years ago, there was an article about time, and here's the very credible physicist saying that our time is really an illusion. It's a very powerful illusion created by our mistaken perception and belief that reality is the way that we think that we're experiencing it. But this is really just a kind of a lower down projection of a much deeper reality in which time doesn't have meaningfulness. So there have been stories coming up in Scientific American over the past several years that if you just changed a few of the descriptors here or there, you could go, well, what mystical writings did this come from? I mean, seriously, they're just pretty amazing. And some of the, oh, and by the way, if you don't know Brian Greene, who's a string theorist, and he's written some really interesting books, is coming to Texas A&M here, I believe on October the 18th, and you can look online to get tickets, but I'd really encourage you to go see him if you want to find the latest theories about cosmology that I'm sure will be pretty mind-boggling too. Okay, well, what's another quality we ascribe to the divine? How about omnipotence, right? Omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. Sound like things that we tend to say? Well, if you're going to be omnipotent, you need to have something to have supreme power over, right? What does that mean? Well, you have to have an existence. You have to have a manifestation. So it doesn't make any sense logically to ascribe the God that's beyond all of existence as being omnipotent, because there's nothing to be omnipotent about or over. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? So these qualities we ascribe to God that are pretty deeply ingrained are dependent upon there being a manifestation. Okay, and not only that, but they're dependent upon there being a relationship between beings in manifestation and what we think of as God or the divine. So I challenge you to pick any divine quality. How about holiness? And think about it. what would holiness mean if there wasn't somebody to experience it? Now, you can take this up and go, traditions say that there are beings that exist on subtle levels of reality, and I think that that's true. So they talk about the angels being in adoration with God, but still, there's something that's manifest. It may be manifestation on a more subtle level of reality in relationship to something that's transcendent to it. It's the relationship between the two. Well, pick some more qualities. How about compassion? How can you have compassion if there's not two things, someone being compassionate about something else? How can you have beauty without someone to perceive the beauty? So all the things we ascribe to the divine, the qualities, which is the God that it's possible to have a relationship to, this would be the aspect of God that is in relationship with existence, not the aspect that's beyond everything. And Hinduism has a very well-developed philosophy about beyond everything that there is, but there's nothing to really describe about that. So, and the Sufis say, at least some of the Sufis say, that higher than merging with the one being, I mean, going back to the source, they say that what's higher than that is being in relationship, which you think, well, no, it doesn't sound like you've gotten to the top floor. But they're saying the point is not to get to the top floor, because if there's not a relationship, it's impossible to have love, lover, and beloved. So think of your beloveds, anybody that's in love with anybody, and someone said, here, you can do these things and you will get to the supreme state of consciousness in which everything will dissolve and you won't be aware of anything separated from just this infinite experience of bliss. Would you want to trade in your beloved for that? Well, my beloved is at Unity in Rockport today, but I would not sign up. I'll keep. Okay. So qualities ascribed to God don't have a meaning before there was an existence or a creation. Okay. So what's the science story about? Not just the Big Bang, because the scientists have gotten pretty good equations and everything for what happens just an incredibly small fraction of a second after the Big Bang. But they don't have any theories yet that work with everything else for even closer in time to the Big Bang. And they're really working on that. But in terms of, well, what was there before the Big Bang, or why did the Big Bang arise? Some of you may have heard of terms like the zero-point field. Have you ever heard of that? Or the, think of a vacuum. And think of what you probably got taught about vacuums in school. And I remember in science, it might have been 8th grade science class, the teacher had a bell jar and something that could suck the air out, and there was a way that a bell could be rung inside the jar, and once all the air was gone, you couldn't hear the bell because there wasn't anything to conduct the sound waves. Okay, so we usually think of a vacuum as just the absence of anything, it's nothingness. And the way that remember terms that we were taught in school? Empty space. Just empty space. You know, there's the stars, but then there's just empty space. And I'm sure most of us grew up, and many of us probably still continue to think that the stuff that's in between all that is just nothingness. You know. Well, in actuality, now the physicists are saying that nothingness is full of somethingness, and it's called the quantum vacuum, sometimes called the quantum foam, and there's an unconceivable amount of, if we could harness the potential energy in, I think I mentioned this last time, in a cubic centimeter of what we think of as empty space, there would be more energy in that than there is in the whole physical universe. Well, talk about a solution to the power crisis. I mean, well, we don't quite know how to do that. So, and this is mind-boggling because in the absence of anything, I mean, any ordinary atoms or electrons or things like that, there's just this sea of potential that's these virtual particles that are coming into and out of existence just because of what's called the uncertainty principle that's built into the laws of existence. That's why we can't get things down to absolute zero, because if we could, we would know the location and momentum of something, and we can't know both of those precisely. The closer we zero in on one, the more uncertain there is about the other. And that's why we can't make bigger and bigger microscopes and see down to beyond a certain point. There's never going to be a microscope that can see that, because the uncertainty principle, the microscope would disturb what we're looking at. Okay. So from this quantum vacuum, there's always things coming and going, and sometimes particles emerge and they break free and become actual manifest particles. Okay. Well, there's an energy state of the quantum vacuum, and so one of the theories about what caused the Big Bang to arose is there was a break in the symmetry of a higher quantum vacuum energy state, and that broken symmetry caused the singularity that became the Big Bang that creation arose from. Well, I don't know about you, but that sounds just as mystical as any of these other stories I read, and probably a little bit more, like, what? And nobody knows that our universe is at the lowest possible state of the quantum vacuum, so it's theoretically possible that there would be a collapse of this state and a whole other universe would emerge from that. So I don't think they sell insurance policies for that, though. So. But seriously, some people are worried that in the large particle colliders, now they have ways of generating these teeny tiny black holes that don't last very long. But some people express scientists to worry that if you were to create a little black hole of a certain size, how do we know it's not just going to suck everything in manifest existence into it and poof, we're gone? So there was some people trying to stop the particle accelerators from doing what they're doing, because this is the scientific criers of the apocalypse is coming. But most scientists don't think that we quite are going to bring that about. So anyway, if it happened, we wouldn't know about it. Okay, so let me read you some other theories about the quantum vacuum.
Excuse me, can I just ask one question?
Yes.
You said that the accelerators now can actually produce the small black holes?
Yes. Uh-huh. Okay, so at least they think that it's possible that they can, and I believe so. Okay, I'm not positive about that, but I think that they can. Okay, so these are some scientists, and these are theories that they have. One of them is that the quantum vacuum could be a sea of information and a conveyor of information. And they go on to say, if the vacuum is a frictionless medium, the wave memory of the universe may be eternal. So the quantum vacuum is the same thing as the Akashic record by quantum wave function. Okay, well, this is scientists saying this. Another one saying a hypothesis: the quantum vacuum generates the holographic field that is the memory of the universe. So he's not saying, well, this God is doing this. He's saying this quantum vacuum, which is an inherent property of, you can't even say existence in the way we think about it, but let's say reality. Quantum vacuum is that from which everything arises. Okay, it's saying that it generates a holographic field that's the memory of the universe. And here's some more hypotheses. The vacuum fluctuations that gave rise to our universe were modulated due to the information conveyed to our universe by a prior universe. And I talked some of this last week. I'll say it a little more about this again. I'll read that again. So imagine you've got a new scripture, but it's the science scripture. And it starts off, instead of in the beginning, it says, before this existence, the vacuum fluctuations that gave rise to our universe were modulated due to the information conveyed to our universe by a prior universe. Okay, and there's serious scientists saying this, and I wouldn't be surprised if you go hear Brian Greene, he talks about things like this, because physics kind of has a postulate, a deep, belief that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can change form to matter back to energy. And now many physicists are saying that more fundamental than energy or matter is consciousness. Okay, and some very high-powered physicists are saying that, and others say instead of consciousness, it's information, but not in the way that we think about information as just facts. So let me see if I can find this bit I printed out about how they're describing information. I brought it. I guess I don't have it, but information requires there to be somehow more organization in a state of a system than just kind of randomness. In other words, if you remember thermodynamics, the disorder is always increasing. Well, information is the opposite of that. There's more order when there's information. So some scientists are saying information is more fundamental than even energy or matter, and that information can't be lost. It can change from one form to another. So you can lose those directions, but they're someplace. Or if you burn them, they've been converted into smoke. It might be hard to get them back from that, but okay. And so now the question, and if you've read Stephen Hawking, and he has some books that are actually a little bit easier to understand than others, but still rather challenging. One very interesting one's called The Universe in a Nutshell. And that's just fascinating. And he's pondering the question of what happens to information that falls into a black hole. Because if you're familiar with black holes, once something crosses the event horizon, it can never come back out. Light can't come back out of a black hole. And so if information can't be lost, what happens to it? Because Stephen Hawking has shown that eventually even black holes will dissolve. It's going to take just an unbelievable number of years for that to happen. But when the black hole dissolves, it radiates out all of its energy and it's not there anymore, what happened to the information that's stored in there? And some physicists go, well, it's lost. We don't know quite how to relate this to information. It's lost. And others are going, well, it can't be lost. What happens? Some are saying, well, it actually is stored in holographic form at the event horizon, the point of no return. Of course, you might have a little trouble getting it out, because if you get close enough to try to get it, you're in trouble. In fact, they had an article in Scientific American years ago, what would happen to an astronaut that got sucked into a black hole? Well, the astronaut wouldn't know anything different when he crossed the event horizon, but if you're somewhere on the good side of the event horizon and you saw this, what you'd see is the astronaut getting to the event horizon and just being frozen forever, because that light couldn't come back, so it would just stop. But the astronaut doesn't know anything different, but at a certain point there's a phenomenon called spaghettification. I didn't make this up. And what would happen is whichever way was more to the center of the black hole, the gravitational forces would pull more on that, and eventually the astronaut would be stretched out to a very thin strip of spaghetti, and not good. Anyway. But one of the theories about black holes, which is being taken seriously, is that it's possible that all the information that gets into the black hole could arise in the form of a white hole that emerges in a new universe. Well, does this sound like some of the things that I've read to you? And so this is one, to me, an explanation that makes sense, well, for two things. One, and I believe I mentioned this some last week, that one of the current theories of cosmology is that there's the multiverse, that this is not the only universe, that our universe is like a pearl on a string of beads, and we can't really know anything about the other ones because we're not in contact with them, they're too far away, and so on. But that, and in string theory, there are 10 to the 500th possible kinds of laws of physics, or landscapes they're called, or universes that could be. But in most of those, there'd be nobody to give talks like this, because life couldn't emerge. Some of them, even matter couldn't have emerged, and so on. And so some people are putting the question, well, the important constants in physics, if they weren't the way they are down to sometimes 14 decimal points, there couldn't be life in the universe. Well, your question about randomness, was that just random luck of the draw? We had this big bang, and it just so happened that all these things had to be accurate to 10 to the 14th decimal point, so it's hard enough to balance our checkbooks. But so how could this just be random? Well, one of the theories is, well, if you have 10 to the 500 possibilities, somewhere in some existence it'll happen. Okay, well, that seems to be kind of a cop-out answer. That's like, well, anything could happen, so yeah, maybe that could happen someplace, and it just happened here. But the other theory is that if there were previous existences, if universes can emerge from white holes, from other universes through black holes, and if all the information from that universe is encoded in what emerges into the new universe, then kind of the theory of evolution of the multiverse, that universes evolve throughout the creations of them, and what works continues into other creations, and that's why we have what we have, because that's what worked, what brought about there to be the existence like we have. Well, now we get into metaphysical questions. Well, who or what, if there's really just this impersonal quantum vacuum and all this going on, why should any of these manifestations be a little anthropomorphic care if there's humans or life or whatever, because it's just cold physics? Okay. Well, now we get into Seth Lloyd, who's a scientist at MIT, a computer scientist. He has theorized, and this was also in Scientific American, not the National Enquirer, Scientific American. He hypothesized that our whole universe, and universe, I'll put with a capital U, is not just what we can see with our senses, because if you've ever looked at the electromagnetic spectrum, we can always even perceive a tiny part of light. I mean, bees can see ultraviolet light, we can't see, and so on, but there's a whole rest of that spectrum. And if you've ever seen pictures of the universe taken by infrared telescopes and or things that radio telescopes pick up, there's a lot more out there than meets the eye. So there's a lot more to manifestation than we can ordinarily perceive. But this is just a tiny drop in the bucket of what there is. Okay. So, and what Seth Lloyd says is the universe, the whole kit and caboodle, is a giant quantum computer. And then this, again, Scientific American, what is it seeking to compute? Itself. In other words, it's trying to understand itself. It's trying to, it'd be like the sci-fi movies about artificial intelligence reaching self-awareness, becoming self-conscious. Well, in Sufism, the explanation about why there was an existence, it said that God was a hidden treasure. There's different translations, desiring to be known, or to know, or to love, or to be loved. And so the divine brought forth an existence. But it was for whatever that transcendent, undescribable ocean of light, or beyond the beyond, whatever it was, somehow something arose in that, or as I mentioned with Sophia, drew forth from it a desire to know or to be known. Well, this is what Seth Lloyd is saying. And we're going to be talking in some of the remaining classes about chaos theory and a phenomena called self-emergence. How do systems self-organize to higher and higher levels? But that's just the nature of them. So I'll give you a little tidbit here, and I'll probably mention again when we get to that class. But computer scientists can do simulations of computer versions of life. And the way they do that is they just generate some very simple rules to a system. So it may be a system that just kind of randomly, imagine a checkerboard and all the boxes are blank, and randomly either a black or white will come on in a square. Well, the rules might be if there's 2 black or 3 black ones in a row, they get to continue. If there's a white and a black and a white, it wipes it all out. So they put these very simple rules in. There might be 4 rules or something. You wouldn't think anything interesting would happen. And some of you who may have been readers of Scientific American may have heard about the game of life. And this is not the game of life with the board and you go to college and spin and all that. But this was a game with simple rules like that. And they found when they let this game run for a very long time, or a version of it, that things would evolve in this simple little system. And there would be the computer simulated life version of different societies where there'd be like trade, there'd be wars, there'd be the equivalent of viruses that would wipe things out. And just from these very simple rules that you could never imagine could evolve into something more complex like that, but they do. But even more interesting, so one of the researchers decide, well, you know, the real world's a mess. I mean, just turn on CNN. What if we make our nice computer world a utopia? And so we're going to make it play nice. No wars, no viruses, just things get better. Everybody plays fair. Well, what happened in every single simulation that they ran, remember these start off just with random inputs, the system would evolve to a certain point and then everything would just die out. It would be gone. So, makes you wonder about things that we certainly perceive of as not good things in the world, viruses and wars and things like that, and we'd like to have a utopian world in which none of these things exist, but somehow it seems to be built into the fabric of there being an evolving existence. There's always going to be some form of this, and it'd be nice if the war of the future could be, 2 leaders playing chess together, and the winner gets the goods, or what, instead of all these people getting killed or whatever. Or we can wipe out, we're going to conquer this disease. We've cured this. Well, then what happens is the bacteria are actually very smart, and viruses, they evolve to something more, and now none of the things that we have work anymore. And so now we're going to, get stronger things. But it's an impossibility that we could ever not have anything like that there, because that's built into life itself. We wouldn't have life without these things. And that's kind of strange. And it's kind of an answer to philosophical questions. How could a God who is, fill in the blank, compassionate with that, allow there to be X, Y, and Z in the world? Well, another way of looking at that is, God is compassionate enough to allow this to be, because there wouldn't be the life to be wondering about these questions if there weren't these things to deal with. And in Hinduism, in Tantra Yoga, they have a very interesting philosophical way of describing this phenomena. There's 2 main forces in existence. One is called Vidyamaya, which means movement toward the light, and the other is called Avidyamaya, which is like the dark forces moving away from the light. And what they go on to say is it's only by the conflict between these 2 forces toward the light and away from the light that there's any light at all. We couldn't have light without this. And so we are so conditioned to think dualistically, not just in our perception of our relationship to the physical world, much less to God, but dualistically in terms of things that we like and we don't like, and we'd like to only have the ones that we like. So a question to think about would be if someone said, well, science has made a real breakthrough. There's a pill you can take that if you take this, you'll be nothing but happy the rest of your life. Okay, well, the first question is, would you take it? And why not? Why wouldn't you take it? So what would happen if you did? What do you think would happen after a while?
Awareness would shrink.
Well, happiness wouldn't have any meaning. What does it mean to be happy if everything's... And I've told this story before in previous classes, but it's too good not to share again. My favorite Twilight Zone is one in which this gangster dies He finds himself, he knows he's dead, but he finds himself in this little town, and this very nice gentleman comes and said, "Oh, welcome, sir, we've been expecting you, and I'm going to show you around, and in this town, you can have anything you want." "Anything I want? Oh, this is great." And he says, "Cars? Oh, yeah." And all these fancy cars just appear out of the blue. "Women? Oh, yeah, these gorgeous women." And he says, "What about gambling?" "Oh, yeah, come on in here." And so he goes into this bar and he plays pool, and every shot he makes goes in the hole, and he gambles, and he always wins every hand. And after a while, and he turns to his host and he says, "You know, I really appreciate all the kindness that you've shown me. This is wonderful, just all this, but how can you call this place heaven? I'm bored to tears. I get everything I want. There's nothing interesting. There's no action or excitement." And the host turns and said, "Who says this is heaven?" So the old saying, be careful of what you ask for that you might get it. Okay, let me pause here and see if there's any other questions, because I must say this series of classes has an ambitious agenda that forces me to try to cover the creation story and the Big Bang in one class and then move on to manifestation in the next one, but I hope we can surf enough through things to whet your appetite for more discovery. So, yes.
Don, we've been talking about the Big Bang, but you talked about it earlier, other universe, multiverses. So is it a Big Bang or the Big Bang?
Well, as far as we're concerned, it's the Big Bang, but many cosmologists are saying it's not probably not the only Big Bang. It's just the Big Bang that resulted in this particular universe, and there could be an infinite number of universes. And I sure hope I brought this passage. I want to read you. Let me see. Well, I'm afraid I left that one at home. But there's, in the Zohar, again, which is the part of the mystical writings of the Kabbalah and Judaism, there's a part in there, and I wish I had brought this, but anyway, it's saying that this isn't the first creation that's described in Genesis, that God created 1,000 worlds before this, but he didn't like them, so he destroyed them. And then this one came along, and it's what he got. And then some places in there it says that God regrets having created man. But unfortunately, the laws of physics that God signed on for this one is that he couldn't wipe things out. He had to let things take their course. So here we are. But this, again, this is pretty amazing. This is in the part of the Kabbalah. Some mystics from hundreds of years ago, the Kabbalah, I think, was written in the 1400s, are saying that there were 1,000 previous creations before this. Well, this goes with the theory of the multiverse, and the universe is evolving, and some of them enable life to take place, and others don't work at all. And so we end up with this one. But somehow information is carried over through these different creations. Okay, so now we have, again, a tie-in between scientists, contemporary scientists, and mystics, really describing very similar phenomena with just different metaphysical terms or scientific terms, but they're really talking about the same basic idea. And what the mystics say is there can't be two truths, at least some of them. There can't be the truth of religion and then the truth of science. And as I mentioned some of this last time, the way most people tend to deal with this is just kind of compartmentalize, well, this is my religion hat, and this is the way I think over here, and now I'll think about the science, and I won't worry too much about how they go together, particularly if your aim in religion or spirituality is to go somewhere else after you die, so who cares about this isn't going to matter in the long run. Well, next week, I'm going to be talking about different traditions, ways of dealing with the relationship or the description of manifestation or the importance of manifestation, and is there an evolution that takes place? And I'm not just talking about Darwinian evolution. Is there something, a divine purpose that is fulfilled on an ongoing basis by continuing awakening of beings in manifestation, not getting out of it, as opposed to mystical and religious traditions that say, well, the aim is really to go to heaven, get saved, get liberated. In Buddhism, go beyond the wheel of being and becoming. In yoga, to merge with the absolute, undescribable, and so on. But there's a spirituality that says, well, the purpose is really fulfilled by the divine in life. And if scientists think that there's any meaningfulness in the world, and many of them do, and some of them are just, hardcore atheists in the sense of not, I'm not talking about atheism, not believing in a separated God. I'm talking about, well, there's no purpose to anything. It's just all random whatnot, and there's nothing more than what happens beyond this. But if they feel that there's even an emergent property, even Seth Lloyd talking about the quantum universe seeking to compute itself, then there is a purpose in manifestation. And then the question in our spirituality becomes, well, what part do we have in that? It's not just about us going back to where we came from, or having the same generic, trying to have the same generic, in quotes, enlightenment of the Buddha. Well, that wouldn't be so bad, but that's not what our purpose is to have our own awakening. If there's some purpose in that, then what does that say about what drives our spirituality, our religion, our sense of what the world is about, and what role we have to play in that? And it makes a big difference how we tend to look at that, especially with going back to science, quantum physics, saying there's nothing that's not totally interconnected with everything else in every level of existence, including the stuff that arises from the quantum vacuum. It's an illusion to think that we ever could be separated from the totality, and that gives rise to the thought of, well, how could there be something we think of as God that could be separated from everything that there is? And I'm not just talking about manifestation, because remember, the quantum vacuum, you can't really talk about it. There's not individualized consciousness in there. So maybe it's just the whole kit and caboodle awakening up to itself and emerging on the human end of things, us becoming more capable of participating in our relationship with what we think of as God or the transcendent, but also participating in this ongoing process of emergence that's taking place in existence. So that's kind of a little intro to what I'm going to be getting into next time. Yes, Rick?
I've always been told, thought, and I don't know if it's even true, that we only use 15% of our brain. And I wonder if you know anything about that, Don, if we are in some kind of evolutionary path toward using more of our brain. And in fact, if we get to 80, 90, 100%, that's a manifestation of everything you're talking about.
Well, if that were possible, I would say it would be a itty-bitty piece of that, because I believe we're beings that are much more than our physical organ of the brain, or even what's capable through the brain. And if you believe that the existence continues after this world, however you look at that, well, we don't have the organ of the brain anymore. But there's certainly, I think, that we are, most of the world is at a very small fraction of the percentage of our capacity for awakening to the true nature of who we are and what our relationship is or could be to the world we find ourselves in.
Well, you said 21 possible
Dimensions.
And isn't it just a matter of perception? When you say it's something we just can't see or relate to through our current means of perception, but if that brain power were increased.
Well, that's an interesting. The question is, if our brain power were increased, would we be able to experience those if there's 21 dimensions? I think not through the ordinary modality of thinking or consciousness. Now, mystical experiences, or what's described as cosmic states of consciousness, I think it is possible to have experiences. In fact, there are stories of, there was a story of a king in Persia that wanted a history written of times in the kingdom before there was any records, and so he hired, he brought forth all these academicians and whatever, and And then finally he consulted a mystic, and the mystic says, well, I can bring, and the mystic just in his consciousness went back and told the king this whole history that there was no ordinary means of knowing. So I think we have the capacity of having consciousness beyond the ordinary limitations of space and time, and that'll be something I'll get into in some later things about. Some studies have been done with remote viewing for one, and studies that have been done even where they've taken a person's DNA, some blood, and put it in another lab, and then they stress the person, and it would cause changes in the DNA that was sitting in the laboratory, action at a distance. And they could put this stuff in a Faraday cage that blocks out all known electromagnetic things, so there's no physical force going. But there's so much research about that, I'll only be able to scratch the surface.
And perhaps we think in terms of brain power, but it may be more an opening for more heart power.
Well, I think it's opening to, the mystics say that there's many subtle energy centers in our being, and these can be awakened through, I would call it spiritual technology, that really, I think, can be independent of particular belief systems. And once those are opened up, then there's, I think, and I'm going to get into subtle energy research in a later class, there's things that are possible that would not ordinarily be possible. Basically, the laws of physics are different than, you had a question, or? Yeah.
Have you, I've just heard of the book, but I haven't read it, and I was wondering if you had, What Is This Is Heaven by Anita Marjani. Have you read it?
I haven't read it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what she has to say.
I haven't read that book. Yeah.
At the beginning of today's class, I think I heard you say something about sort of like when God was deciding I want something, that there was also something wanting to be
That's my theory. This force that, or this being that's described in Proverbs as wisdom, I think is the same as the being of Sophia. That, and I'll get into this at another class, but I think there's, on the one end, it seems like God has this desire to put something out, but I think that desire arose because something else, and we can call it Sophia, but the archetype of wisdom, drew forth the desire. That there had to be a drawing forth of the desire for there to be a desire. They both go together. And our time has gone by